The sound was so faint that most would have missed it, but Ranger's ears pricked forward, his scarred muzzle lifting toward the deepening shadows of the Appalachian forest. The German shepherd froze mid-stride, his powerful body suddenly tense as a bowstring. There it was again, a thin, reedy cry, carried on the autumn breeze. Something stirred in the old military dog's memory. Afghanistan, the rubble of a collapsed building. A sound just like this one. Ranger moved without hesitation, breaking from the trail he'd been patrolling. His paws made no sound on the carpet of fallen leaves as he tracked the noise deeper into the woods, guided by instinct, older than training. What the 7-year-old German shepherd found hidden among the fallen leaves would not only change his life forever, it would reveal a conspiracy that had already claimed 2 lives and was about to claim a 3rd. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia wore their early October colors like a patchwork quilt: crimson maples, golden oaks, and the deep evergreen of pines. In a small clearing 5 miles from the nearest paved road stood a weathered cabin, smoke curling from its stone chimney. This was home to Robert "Bobby" McAllister and his only companion, Ranger. Bobby had built this life of solitude deliberately after returning from his 3rd tour with the Army Rangers. At 35, his body carried fewer visible scars than his mind. The cabin offered what he needed: most distance from the noise, the crowds, the constant reminders of what he'd lost overseas. Most days, he spoke to no one except Ranger. The German shepherd had come to him 2 years ago through a rehabilitation program for military working dogs like Bobby. Ranger carried the invisible wounds of war. The visible one, a jagged scar running through his left eye, leaving it clouded and partially blind, told only part of his story. The rest was written in his behavior: the way he startled at sudden noises, how he sometimes woke whimpering from dreams, the vigilant scanning of his surroundings. Ranger had served 3 tours in Afghanistan with his handler, Staff Sergeant Mike Donnelly. Their last mission ended with an IED explosion that killed Donnelly instantly. Witnesses reported that Ranger had refused to leave his handler's body, attempting to drag him to safety until he collapsed from his own injuries. The military psychiatrist who evaluated Ranger had used the same term they used for Bobby: PTSD. The dog was deemed unsuitable for continued service or adoption by an ordinary family. Bobby had recognized something in the shepherd's damaged gaze, a reflection of his own brokenness. They understood each other in ways that required no words. 5 miles from Bobby's cabin stood Riverview Regional Medical Center, where Sarah Whitman worked the pediatric emergency ward. At 32, she'd earned a reputation for exceptional care, particularly with the most traumatized children. What few people knew was how personal that mission was for her, having lost her older brother in Afghanistan years before. Like Bobby and Ranger, Sarah carried her own private burden of grief, channeling it into her work with a quiet determination. None of them could have imagined how their separate lives were about to collide because of what Ranger would discover in the woods that afternoon. The day had begun like any other at the cabin. Bobby rose before dawn, his internal clock still set to military time despite the years of civilian life. He'd fed Ranger, brewed coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and settled onto the porch to watch the sunrise paint the mountains. These quiet moments were the closest he came to peace. "What'd you say we check the North Ridge today?" "Boy." Bobby scratched behind Ranger's good ear. The shepherd's tail swept once across the wooden plank's acknowledgment rather than enthusiasm. They'd patrol the property's boundaries each day, a routine that satisfied both the man's need for order and the dog's territorial instincts. By early afternoon, they'd covered most of their usual route. The October air carried a hint of the coming cold, not yet winter but no longer summer. Leaves crunched beneath Bobby's boots as he followed the narrow game trail that marked his property line. Ranger trotted ahead, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush only to emerge moments later. The first sign something was wrong came when Ranger stopped suddenly, his body rigid. The dog's ears swiveled forward, catching something beyond human hearing. Bobby recognized the posture. It was the same alert stance Ranger had been trained to take when detecting explosives or hostile forces. "What is it, boy?" Bobby knelt beside the shepherd, automatically scanning their surroundings for threat. Nothing seemed out of place in the familiar woods. Ranger whined low in his throat, taking 2 steps toward a denser part of the forest before looking back at Bobby. "Show me," Bobby commanded. But Ranger just whined again, shifting his weight anxiously from paw to paw. Bobby sighed. This had happened before phantom triggers that sent Ranger back to the war. The VA counselor called them environmental cues. Something as simple as a certain quality of light or particular smell could transport Ranger back to Afghanistan. During these episodes, the best approach was calm reassurance, not reinforcement. "It's okay, boy. We're in Virginia. We're safe." Bobby kept his voice steady, the same tone he'd used to talk down one of his men during a moment of combat stress. "Let's head back. Storm's coming anyway." The clouds had indeed been gathering all afternoon, and now the light took on that peculiar quality that precedes rainfall. Bobby tugged gently on Ranger's lead, redirecting him toward home. The dog followed reluctantly, looking back several times. Once home, Bobby's own fatigue caught up with him. The nightmares had been worse lately, leaving him exhausted. "Just gonna close my eyes for a minute, Ranger," he murmured, stretching out on the couch. The shepherd settled on the rug nearby, still unusually alert, eyes fixed on the door. Bobby didn't notice when Ranger rose silently and nosed open the door's latch, a trick the clever dog had mastered months ago but rarely employed. By the time Bobby woke, the afternoon had faded toward evening, and Ranger was gone. Deep in the forest, Ranger moved with purpose. The sound had returned clearer now without Bobby's heavy footfalls masking it. His training and instincts worked in tandem as he navigated the increasingly dense woods. The light was failing, filtered through clouds and canopy into a gray twilight. The crying grew louder as Ranger pushed through a thicket of rhododendron. In a small clearing beyond, partially sheltered by an overhanging rock, sat an old wooden cradle. The sight stopped the shepherd cold. This wasn't right. Cradles belonged in houses, with people. Not here in the wilderness as darkness approached. Ranger approached cautiously, nose working overtime. Multiple human scents clung to the cradle, some fresh, others hours old. No threat scent, but something else: fear, stress, and the unmistakable smell of a human infant. The baby's cries had weakened to whimpers by the time Ranger reached the cradle. Tiny fists waved feebly in the air, face red from exertion and cold. At roughly 6 months old, the infant boy wore only a thin onesie, despite the dropping temperature. A small blanket had been dislodged by his movements, leaving him exposed to the cooling air. Ranger knew cold. He'd worked mountain passes in Afghanistan where the temperature dropped fast after sunset, claiming the lives of unprepared travelers. He understood hypothermia from the specialized winter training all military dogs received. Without hesitation, Ranger pressed his warm body against the side of the cradle. The baby's cries momentarily intensified at the sight of the large animal, then quieted as the warmth began to penetrate his chilled limbs. With careful delicacy, Ranger used his tongue to clean the infant's face, removing the dried tears and mucus that had accumulated. The light continued to fade from the sky. Ranger could smell rain coming and hear distant thunder. He needed to get the human pup to safety, but his training collided with instinct never leave someone vulnerable alone, but seek help for those in need. Ranger tried barking, the sound echoing through the trees. He listened intently for a response, for any human voice or approaching footsteps, but heard nothing except the normal sounds of the forest preparing for night. Making a decision, Ranger used his nose to carefully arrange the fallen blanket back over the baby. Then he began gathering fallen leaves with his paws, piling them around the cradle for additional insulation. The technique was one he'd seen humans use in the mountains of Afghanistan. Natural materials could provide surprising warmth. The first raindrops began to fall, cold and insistent. Ranger positioned himself to block the worst of it from reaching the cradle, his body forming a living shield against the elements. The baby had quieted, seemingly soothed by the dog's presence and warmth, though occasional whimpers suggested hunger or discomfort. As full darkness descended, new threats emerged. Ranger's acute hearing picked up the movements of nocturnal predators, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of something larger moving through underbrush. His hackles rose instinctively. The forest that seemed so peaceful during daylight patrols now revealed its more dangerous nature. A twig snapped nearby. Ranger rose to his feet, positioning himself between the cradle and the potential threat. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a warning that needed no translation in any language. Whatever approached this human pup would have to come through him first. The rain fell harder now, and somewhere far off, Bobby would be waking to find his companion missing. But here, in this small clearing, Ranger had found a new mission, one that resonated with the protective instincts bred into his bloodline for generations and honed by military training. He would stand guard, no matter what the night might bring. Bobby jerked awake, momentarily disoriented in the dim cabin. The storm had arrived in full force, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the mountains. His hand automatically reached down to touch Ranger's head, a grounding ritual after nightmares, but found only empty space. Ranger. His voice echoed in the cabin's silence. Bobby sat up, fully alert now. The shepherd was nowhere in sight. The front door stood slightly ajar, rain spattering the threshold. A cold knot formed in Bobby's stomach. "No, no, no," he muttered, pushing himself up. Ranger never left without him, not voluntarily. The dog was his shadow, his constant companion. Bobby's heart began to race, his breathing shallow and quick. The familiar tightening in his chest signaled the onset of a panic attack. He braced himself against the wall, forcing air into his lungs. "Not now," he growled through clenched teeth. Unbidden, his mind flashed back to Kandahar province, the frantic radio calls, the sound of gunfire, the knowledge that his team was pinned down and he couldn't reach them in time. 5 men lost that day. 5 brothers he'd failed to protect. The memory threatened to pull him under. But concern for Ranger provided an anchor. Bobby forced himself through the breathing exercises his VA counselor had taught him. 5 counts in, hold, 7 counts out. Repeat. When the worst of the attack had passed, Bobby grabbed his rain jacket and a powerful flashlight. "Hang on, buddy," he murmured. "I'm coming." Outside, the rain fell in sheets. Bobby pulled his jacket closer, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Ranger," he called, his voice swallowed by the storm. He started along their usual patrol route, scanning for paw prints in the mud. The trail quickly became treacherous, fallen leaves turning slick under the downpour. Bobby slipped twice, cursing as he caught himself on tree trunks. The second fall sent a jolt of pain through his bad knee, another souvenir from Afghanistan. An hour into his search, doubt began to creep in. The forest covered miles of difficult terrain. Ranger could be anywhere, and in this weather. Bobby pushed the thought away. He wouldn't lose Ranger, too. Not like this. Think, he told himself. What would make him leave? The answer came suddenly. Ranger's alert posture that afternoon. The dog had sensed something Bobby had dismissed. If he'd been wrong, if there really had been something out there. Bobby changed direction, heading toward where Ranger had first stopped on their patrol. The going was even rougher now, the trail less defined, the storm intensified, lightning briefly illuminating the forest in stark white flashes. When Bobby heard it, a dog's bark cutting through the storm, he froze. It came again, unmistakably Ranger's deep warning bark. Not his alert bark or his excited bark, but the one Bobby had heard only twice before, the protective bark Ranger used when defending something he considered under his care. Bobby moved faster now, heedless of the branches whipping his face. The barking grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Bobby crashed through a thicket of rhododendron and stumbled into a small clearing. What he saw made him doubt his own eyes. Ranger stood in a defensive posture, teeth bared, facing off against what appeared to be a coyote at the edge of the clearing. Behind the shepherd, partially sheltered by an overhanging rock, sat what looked like an old-fashioned wooden cradle. Bobby's flashlight beam revealed Ranger's soaked fur, standing up in ridges along his spine. The coyote hesitated, caught in the sudden light. Bobby shouted and waved his arms, and the predator slunk back into the darkness. "Ranger, what the hell?" Bobby approached slowly, still struggling to process what he was seeing. The shepherd relaxed slightly at his approach, but remained positioned beside the cradle. When Bobby's flashlight beam fell across the cradle's contents, he nearly dropped it in shock. A baby, an actual human infant, lay wrapped in a thin blanket, surrounded by leaves that Ranger had apparently piled around for insulation. The baby's face was surprisingly clean, its eyes closed in sleep despite the storm. "Jesus Christ," Bobby whispered. He knelt beside the cradle, setting down his flashlight. With shaking hands, he checked the infant for signs of injury. The baby stirred at his touch but didn't wake. Cold, definitely, but still breathing steadily. Bobby shrugged out of his rain jacket and draped it over the cradle for additional protection. "Good boy, Ranger. Good boy." His voice broke as he realized what had happened. Ranger had found the abandoned infant and had been trying to tell him all afternoon. When Bobby didn't understand, the dog had taken matters into his own paws, standing guard through the storm. As Bobby lifted the blanket to better assess the baby's condition, something hard pressed against his finger. Carefully shifting the infant, he found a small metallic object tucked into the cradle's lining, about the size of a watch battery. It had an almost imperceptible blinking light. Bobby's military training kicked in immediately. He recognized it for what it was, a tracking device, sophisticated and deliberately hidden. This wasn't a case of simple abandonment. Someone had left this baby here with the intention of monitoring its location. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Kidnapping, human trafficking, some kind of ransom situation. Whatever it was, the presence of the tracker changed everything. Bobby made a split-second decision. He removed the device and placed it carefully in his pocket rather than destroying it. Evidence, potentially. Then he gathered the baby into his arms, blanket and all. "Come on, Ranger. We need to move. Now." The journey back to the cabin was painstakingly slow. Bobby cradled the infant against his chest, trying to shield it from the worst of the rain. Ranger led the way, picking the safest path through the storm-darkened forest. Once inside, Bobby's training took over. First priority, warm the baby. He cranked up the cabin's wood stove, then gently dried the infant with a soft towel. The baby woke during this process, whimpering softly but not crying outright, a bad sign, possibly indicating exhaustion or dehydration. Bobby hadn't handled many babies in his life, but field medicine had taught him the basics of treating exposure. He fashioned a makeshift diaper from a clean t-shirt, then wrapped the infant in his warmest blanket. A dropper from his first aid kit served to administer small amounts of water. Only when the baby's condition seemed stabilized did Bobby reach for his satellite phone, the only reliable communication at the remote cabin. His finger hovered over the keypad. 911 was the obvious choice. But the tracking device complicated matters. Someone was monitoring this child, and that someone might be watching official channels. Instead, he dialed a number he rarely used. "Sheriff's Department. Jenkins speaking." The voice that answered was gruff, tired. "Tom, it's Bobby McAllister." A pause. "Bobby Christ, it's been months. You okay? I need you to come out to my place, quietly. No sirens, no radio chatter, no department notification. Just you." Another, longer pause. "What kind of trouble are you in?" "Mac." "Not me." Bobby looked down at the infant now sleeping in his arms. "But I've got a situation here that needs someone I can trust." "Remember that favor you owe me from Fallujah?" "That bad, huh?" Sheriff Tom Jenkins had served with Bobby before returning home to law enforcement. "I'll be there in 40. Alone." While waiting, Bobby searched the cradle more thoroughly. Beyond the tracking device, he found nothing to identify the infant. No note, no ID bracelet, nothing personal at all. The cradle itself was old but solidly built, the kind of handcrafted item passed down through generations. Ranger refused to leave the baby's side, his eyes tracking every movement Bobby made. When Bobby sat in his armchair with the infant, The shepherd pressed against his legs, still on guard. "You did good, buddy," Bobby told him, voice rough with emotion. "Real good." The baby stirred in his arms, eyes blinking open, deep blue eyes that seemed too knowing for an infant. Bobby felt something shift inside him, a protective instinct he thought had died in the mountains of Afghanistan. When Sheriff Jenkins arrived 40 minutes later, his first words upon entering the cabin were, "Well, I'll be damned. When you said situation, I was thinking wounded fugitive, not a baby. Found in the woods during the storm," Bobby explained. "Ranger led me to him." Jenkins knelt to examine the cradle, his law enforcement training evident in his methodical approach. "Any ID?" Bobby showed him the tracking device. "Just this. Someone's keeping tabs on him." The sheriff's expression darkened. "That's not good." He straightened up. "You know, we had a report yesterday about a missing research scientist couple from the facility up near Blackwater Ridge. James and Elena Thompson. Car found abandoned on a Forest Service road not 10 miles from here." Bobby looked down at the sleeping infant, then at Ranger, still standing sentinel. The simple rescue he'd imagined had just become something far more complicated. "Tom," he said quietly, "I think we're going to need a doctor." "But we need one who can keep quiet. Riverview's too public," Sheriff Jenkins said, rubbing his stubbled chin. "County hospitals got reporting protocols for abandoned infants. One call, and every department from here to Richmond will be involved." Bobby nodded, cradling the baby who had begun to stir again. "We need someone who understands discretion." Jenkins's weathered face creased in thought. "There's a pediatric nurse at Riverview, Sarah Whitman. Treated my grandson last year when he had pneumonia. Smart woman, keeps to herself. More importantly, she runs the overnight shift in the children's ward without much supervision. Can she be trusted? As much as anyone. She's got a reputation for putting children first. Rules second." Bobby weighed their limited options. The baby needed professional medical attention that wasn't negotiable. But involving outsiders carried risks he couldn't fully assess without knowing who had abandoned this child and why they were tracking him. "Make the call," Bobby decided. "But tell her to come alone." While Jenkins stepped outside to use his phone away from the cabin's metal roof, Bobby attempted to coax some more water into the baby. The infant accepted a few drops, but his lethargy concerned Bobby. In the field, unresponsiveness usually signaled the body conserving energy, a last-ditch survival mechanism. Ranger hadn't moved from his protective position, his eyes tracking every movement Bobby made with the child. Occasionally, the shepherd would sniff the baby's face, then look up at Bobby with an intensity that seemed almost human in its concern. "Your dog's taken quite a shine to this little one," Jenkins remarked upon returning. "Sarah's coming. Should be here in 30 minutes. Bobby nodded. "Ranger found him first. Been guarding him ever since. That dog always did have better instincts than most people I know." Jenkins settled into a chair across from Bobby. "While we wait, why don't you tell me exactly how you found our little friend here?" Bobby recounted the afternoon's events, Ranger's unusual behavior, his disappearance, and the discovery in the storm. Jenkins listened without interruption, his lawman's eyes cataloging details. "And you're sure about the tracker?" Bobby gestured toward the device now sitting on the table. "Military grade, short range but powerful. Someone wants to know exactly where this baby is at all times. Which means they might come looking when the signal stops moving. Jenkins checked his sidearm reflexively. The implications hung in the silence between them. Headlights swept across the cabin windows. Exactly 28 minutes later, Bobby tensed, but Jenkins raised a calming hand. "That'll be Sarah." The woman who entered was not what Bobby had expected. Sarah Whitman stood around 5'6", her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in jeans and a rain jacket over hospital scrubs. She carried a large medical bag and moved with the efficient confidence of someone accustomed to emergencies. But it was her eyes that caught Bobby's attention, green, sharp, and assessing everything in the room with clinical precision. "Sheriff?" She nodded to Jenkins, then turned to Bobby. "You must be McAllister. Where's the patient?" Bobby shifted the blanket to reveal the infant's face. Something flickered in Sarah's expression, surprise. Then, a deeper emotion she quickly masked with professionalism. "How long has he been in your care?" she asked, already moving forward and setting down her bag. "Found him about 3 hours ago, in the woods, abandoned." Sarah knelt beside Bobby's chair, her focus entirely on the baby now. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hands. Bobby transferred the bundle carefully, watching as she unwrapped the blanket with practiced movements. "He's dehydrated, hypothermic, but responsive to stimuli," she reported, checking pupils, pulse, and skin elasticity with calm efficiency. "Approximately 6 months old, male, no obvious congenital abnormalities." She reached into her bag, producing a digital thermometer, stethoscope, and various other instruments. Throughout her examination, Ranger remained vigilant, watching her hands on the baby with careful attention. "Your dog seems concerned," Sarah observed, glancing at Ranger. "He found the baby. Been acting like his personal guardian ever since." Sarah's hands paused momentarily. "Smart animal." She continued her examination, her touch gentle but thorough. "This child needs fluids, warmth, and proper nutrition. I've brought supplies, but he should really be in a hospital." "That's not an option right now," Bobby said firmly. Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Because—" Bobby glanced at Jenkins, who nodded slightly. "Because someone's tracking him, and we don't know why." To her credit, Sarah didn't immediately dismiss this as paranoia. She finished her examination in silence, administered oral rehydration solution via dropper, and changed the makeshift diaper for a proper one from her supplies. "I need to know what I'm involving myself in," she finally said, cradling the baby against her shoulder with practiced ease. "If this child is in danger, I need the whole picture." Jenkins explained about the tracking device and the missing scientists, while Bobby described Ranger's discovery. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing more concerned. "The Thompsons," she said when they finished. "Elena Thompson came through our ER last month, injured in a lab accident. She claimed, but the pattern of bruising didn't match her story." "You think someone hurt her?" Jenkins leaned forward. "I think she was scared. Asked me 3 times if anyone had been looking for her." Sarah looked down at the baby. She never mentioned having a child. Bobby's instincts, honed by years in combat situations, were buzzing. Too many coincidences. "Agreed," Jenkins said. "Question is, what do we do now?" Sarah had been gently rocking the baby, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. "First, We stabilize this little one. Then we find out who he is and why someone left him in those woods. And if whoever left the tracker comes looking, Bobby asked. Sarah's eyes hardened. Then they'll have to go through me. No one's harming this child. Something about her fierce declaration reminded Bobby of Ranger's protective stance in the forest. He found himself studying her more carefully, the competent hands, the determined set of her jaw, the watchful eyes that missed nothing. "The baby needs a name," she said unexpectedly. "For my own sanity. I can't keep calling him the infant." Jenkins chuckled. "Fair enough. Any suggestions?" Sarah looked at Ranger, who hadn't moved from his vigilant position. "How about Finn Short for found in?" "Finn." Bobby tested the name. "Simple. Strong. I like it." With the immediate medical concerns addressed, they established a rotation for the night. Sarah would monitor the baby now, Finn, while Bobby and Jenkins alternated watch shifts. No one said aloud what they were watching for, but the loaded rifles by the door spoke volumes. Dawn broke clear and cold after the storm. Finn had improved overnight, accepting formula and showing more alertness. Ranger had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping curled at the foot of the chair where Sarah sat with the baby. "Your dog's a hero," Sarah said quietly as Bobby brought her coffee. "Most people would have walked right past that cradle in the storm." "Ranger's not most people," Bobby replied, surprising himself with the assertion. It was true, though he'd long ago stopped thinking of the shepherd as merely an animal. "I can see that." Sarah studied the sleeping dog. "Military working dog." Bobby nodded. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Lost his handler on the last one. Something flickered across Sarah's face. Recognition. Perhaps. Or pain. "He still carries it with him, doesn't he? The war?" The perception startled Bobby. Most people didn't notice the subtle signs of Ranger's trauma, the hypervigilance, the nightmares, the way he positioned himself to see all exits. "We both do," he admitted. Sarah's gaze shifted to him, assessing in that direct way of hers. Before she could respond, Jenkins entered from his perimeter check. "We've got company coming up the drive. Black SUV, government plates." Bobby tensed, his hand moving automatically toward the rifle. "How many?" "Just one vehicle. 2 occupants." "Friends of yours?" Bobby asked. Jenkins shook his head. "Never seen them before. But they're moving slow, headlights on, not trying to sneak up." Bobby made a quick decision. "Sarah, take Finn to the back bedroom. Ranger, stay." The shepherd rose immediately, positioning himself between the front door and the hallway. Sarah retreated down. Bobby picked up his rifle, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. The black SUV parked in the clearing before the cabin, engine idling for a moment before shutting off. 2 men emerged, one in his 50s, silver-haired and wearing a dark suit despite the early hour, the other younger, with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement or military. "Federal agents," Jenkins murmured, peering through the window. "Badge on the younger one's belt." Bobby's jaw tightened. "Let's hear what they have to say." Jenkins opened the door before they could knock, his sheriff's badge clearly visible on his belt. "Morning, gentlemen. What brings federal agents to our neck of the woods after a storm?" The silver-haired man smiled thinly. "Sheriff Jenkins, unexpected to find you here. I'm Agent Donovan, FBI. This is Agent Cortez. We're conducting a search for two missing persons, James and Elena Thompson. The scientists, Jenkins said neutrally. Heard they went missing. Any leads? Their vehicle was found abandoned not far from here, Cortez said. We're canvassing all residences within a 10-mile radius. Bobby stepped forward. This is my property. I haven't seen any scientists. Donovan's gaze shifted to Bobby, then to Ranger standing rigid behind him. Something like recognition flashed in the agent's eyes. You're McAllister, former Army Ranger, correct. Bobby didn't answer, his instincts screaming caution now. Mind if we come in? Donovan continued. Just routine questions. I mind, Bobby said flatly. Sheriff Jenkins here can take your questions and relay anything relevant. The agents exchanged glances. Perhaps another time. Donovan conceded too easily. If you see or hear anything unusual, please contact us immediately. He handed Jenkins a business card. The Thompsons' work is sensitive. Their safe return is a matter of national importance. After the agents departed, Bobby watched their vehicle until it disappeared down the winding drive. They're lying, he said simply. Jenkins nodded. No argument here. FBI doesn't send senior agents door to door for missing persons cases, even sensitive ones. Sarah emerged from the bedroom, Finn cradled against her chest. What did they want? Information about the Thompsons, Bobby replied. But they didn't mention a baby. If Finn belongs to the Thompsons, why wouldn't federal agents searching for them ask about their child? Because they don't know about him, Sarah suggested. Or because they're not really FBI. The implications hung in the air between them. Over the next several days, a pattern established itself. Sarah took leave from the hospital, claiming a family emergency. She remained at the cabin with Finn, monitoring his recovery and researching the Thompsons online. Bobby and Ranger patrolled the property, watchful for any sign of surveillance or return visitors. Jenkins divided his time between his official duties and discreet inquiries about the missing scientists. 5 days after Ranger's discovery, the first news reports about a hero dog began to circulate. Someone in the sheriff's department had leaked information about an abandoned baby rescued by a former military dog. The stories were light on specifics, but heavy on human interest, the loyal shepherd standing guard through a storm, the infant's miraculous survival, the search for the parents. This complicates things, Jenkins said, showing Bobby the newspaper headline, Local Dog Hero Saves Abandoned Baby. Bobby scanned the article. No names, no locations. Could be useful, might smoke out whoever's responsible. Sarah, who had been changing Finn on the coffee table, looked up sharply. Or it might put a target on Ranger's back. If someone went to the trouble of tracking this baby, they won't appreciate publicity. As if understanding, Ranger moved closer to Finn, his body positioned protectively beside the makeshift changing table. That evening, Sarah sat on the cabin's porch, Finn sleeping against her shoulder. Bobby joined her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. The sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the beauty at odds with the tension of their situation. He's gaining weight, Sarah said, accepting the coffee with her free hand. Fever's completely gone. He's going to be fine. Physically, at least. Bobby nodded, his gaze on the darkening forest. Jenkins found something. The Thompsons' research. They were developing treatments for childhood diseases, some kind of therapy using the body's own immune system. Immunotherapy? Sarah supplied. It's cutting-edge work, potentially revolutionary for treating certain conditions. Valuable research. Extremely. The kind pharmaceutical companies would pay millions for. Bobby processed this, connecting dots. Valuable enough to kidnap researchers or their child. Sarah looked down at Finn's sleeping face. A child would make effective leverage. Do as we say, or your baby suffers. But then why abandon him in the woods with a tracker? No less. Maybe they were trying to hide him, Sarah suggested. Maybe the Thompsons realized they couldn't protect him themselves, so they left him where he might be found. But with a way to locate him later, the theory had merit. Bobby had seen similar tactics in war zones, civilians hiding children when danger approached, planning to retrieve them when safe. If that's true, he said slowly, the Thompsons may still be alive. Or they may have died protecting their son. Sarah's voice caught slightly. Bobby found himself studying her profile in the fading light. This isn't your first time dealing with something like this, is it? Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. My brother was in Afghanistan, she finally said. He didn't come home. The simple statement carried the weight of years of grief. Bobby recognized it had heard that same flat tone in his own voice when speaking of lost comrades. I'm sorry, he offered. Knowing the inadequacy of the words, Sarah nodded once, her attention still on Finn. That's why I became a pediatric nurse. Children are resilient. They heal. They adapt. They give me hope. Inside the cabin, Ranger suddenly raised his head from where he'd been dozing, ears alert. A moment later, Bobby's satellite phone rang. It was Jenkins, his voice tight with urgency. Turn on your radio. Emergency band. Bobby complied, and the scratchy voice of a dispatcher filled the cabin. All units respond to possible 10 to 56A at Blackwater Ridge. Coordinates to follow. Repeat, 2 bodies discovered. Requesting full forensic team. Blackwater Ridge, Bobby repeated. That's where the Thompsons' car was found, Jenkins confirmed grimly. I'm heading there now. Stay put until I call you. After hanging up, Bobby turned to find Sarah standing in the doorway. Finn still asleep against her shoulder, her face pale in the porch light. You heard? She nodded, her arms tightening protectively around the baby. If those bodies are the Thompsons, then Finn is an orphan, Bobby finished, and whoever was after his parents might still be looking for him. Ranger moved to Sarah's side, pressing against her leg as if sensing her distress. The shepherd's loyalty had expanded to include both Finn and Sarah. Bobby realized his protective circle growing to encompass this makeshift family thrown together by circumstance. As the night deepened around them, Bobby found himself making a silent promise to the sleeping infant. Whatever came next, whatever dangers still lurked in the shadows, Finn would not face them alone. He had protectors now, a damaged former soldier, a grieving nurse, and a scarred shepherd with the heart of a lion. The question was whether their combined strength would be enough against what was coming. Jenkins didn't return until well after midnight. When he finally arrived at the cabin, the grim set of his mouth told the story before he spoke a word. It's them, he confirmed. Accepting the coffee Bobby pressed into his hands. James and Elena Thompson. County medical examiner made preliminary identification from dental records. Sarah, who had been dozing in the armchair with Finn, straightened up. How did they die? Jenkins hesitated, glancing at the baby. Gunshot wounds, execution style. The brutal simplicity of it hung in the air. Bobby had seen such deaths before, in villages and cities halfway around the world, clean, professional, sending a message. When? Bobby asked. Me puts time of death between 5 and 7 days ago. Bodies were hidden. Would have stayed that way if the storm hadn't washed out part of the ravine where they were dumped. Jenkins set down his mug. There's more. Elena Thompson had defensive wounds, fought hard against whoever took her, and James had been tortured before he was killed. Sarah made a small sound, instinctively cuddling Finn closer. The baby slept on, oblivious to the fate of the parents he would never know. Information extraction, Bobby said flatly. It wasn't a question. Jenkins nodded. Looks that way. Question is, what information were they after? And did they get it? Bobby's eyes went to the sleeping infant. Maybe they were looking for him. That's my thinking, too, Jenkins agreed. Timeline fits. Thompsons realized they were being targeted, hid their baby in the woods with that tracker, then led their pursuers away. Probably hoped to recover him once they dealt with the threat. But they never got the chance, Sarah finished softly. Bobby turned to the window, scanning the darkness beyond. If that's true, whoever killed them doesn't know about Finn. But once they realize the Thompsons didn't have what they were looking for, they'll start looking elsewhere, Jenkins concluded. And that tracking device would have led them straight to the baby if you hadn't found it. Sarah stood, still holding Finn. We need to get him somewhere safe, somewhere official, with protection. No, Bobby and Jenkins said simultaneously. We don't know how high this goes, Jenkins explained. Those FBI agents earlier I called a contact at the Bureau. No agents named Donovan or Cortez are assigned to any missing persons case in Virginia. Imposters, Bobby said grimly. Seems like, and they had government plates, which means they've got resources and connections. Until we know who we're dealing with, official channels aren't safe. Sarah paced the small living room, Finn stirring slightly in her arms. So we're on our own, a sheriff, an ex-soldier, and a nurse against whoever executed 2 scientists. Don't forget Ranger, Bobby said, with the ghost of a smile. The shepherd's ears perked up at his name, despite the grim situation. Sarah's lips twitched in response. My apologies to the hero of the hour. The brief moment of levity faded quickly. Jenkins pulled out his notepad. I've got a friend at the State Crime Lab owes me from way back. She's running the forensics personally, off the books. Might give us something to work with. And I've been researching the Thompsons' work, Sarah added. Their latest project involved childhood immunity, revolutionary stuff that could make traditional vaccines obsolete. Several pharmaceutical companies were competing for exclusive rights. Bobby's tactical mind was already assembling the pieces. Follow the money, he said. Who stood to gain most from their research? And who stood to lose? They worked late into the night, Jenkins making calls on secure lines, Sarah compiling information on her laptop, Bobby cleaning his weapons with the methodical precision drilled into him by years of service. Ranger maintained his vigilant post near Finn, who now slept in a makeshift crib fashioned from a dresser drawer. The cabin had become an unlikely command center and their last line of defense if the worst happened. Around dawn, Sarah's laptop pinged with an incoming email. "It's from my colleague at Riverview," she said, scanning the message. "The one covering my shifts. Someone came asking questions about me yesterday. Claimed to be my cousin looking for my new address." Bobby tensed. Description: young, Latino, well-dressed, called himself Miguel Cortez. "The younger agent from yesterday," Jenkins said. Alarm evident in his voice. "They're connecting dots faster than I expected." Bobby was already moving, checking windows and sight lines with military precision. "We need to relocate. Now." "Where?" Sarah asked, already gathering Finn's supplies. "I've got a hunting cabin," Jenkins offered, 20 miles deeper into the mountains. "Off-grid. No paper trail connecting it to me." "That'll work for now," Bobby agreed. "Pack only essentials. 5 minutes." Years of training kicked in as Bobby assembled a go-bag: weapons, ammunition, first aid supplies, communications equipment. Sarah worked with similar efficiency, prioritizing Finn's needs with a nurse's pragmatism. Jenkins made one last call to his deputy, establishing cover for his absence. Just as they were loading the vehicles, Ranger froze at the front window, a low growl building in his chest. Bobby joined him, peering through the curtains. In the gray dawn light, he could make out movement at the tree line, disciplined, purposeful movement. Not hunters, not hikers. "We've got company," he said quietly. 3, maybe 4 individuals approaching from the north, moving tactically. Jenkins drew his service weapon. "Back door." Bobby shook his head. "Too exposed. We'll take my truck, more clearance for the forest roads." "Sarah, get Finn secured in the back seat. Jenkins, you drive. I'll provide cover." Sarah hesitated only a moment before nodding sharply. Her face set with determination as she gathered Finn into her arms. The baby, sensing the tension, began to whimper. "Ranger, protect," Bobby commanded, pointing to Sarah and Finn. The shepherd immediately positioned himself at Sarah's side, alert and ready. They moved with practiced coordination, Jenkins leading the way to the truck. Sarah and Ranger in the middle, Bobby covering their rear. They had almost reached the vehicle when the first shot cracked through the morning air, splintering wood from the porch post beside Bobby's head. "Go!" Bobby shouted, returning fire toward the tree line. He glimpsed dark figures ducking for cover as Jenkins gunned the truck's engine. Sarah scrambled into the back seat with Finn, Ranger leaping in beside her. Bobby fired 2 more covering shots before diving into the passenger seat. Jenkins didn't wait for the door to close before accelerating down the rugged driveway. More shots followed them, one shattering the rear window. Sarah ducked protectively over Finn, while Ranger placed his body between them and the broken glass. "Everyone okay?" Bobby called over the roar of the engine and the crunch of gravel under tires. "We're good," Sarah answered, her voice remarkably steady. "Finn's scared, but not hurt." Jenkins navigated the truck off the main drive and onto a narrow forest track barely visible among the underbrush. The big vehicle lurched and bounced over roots and rocks, branches scraping against its sides. "They'll have vehicles," Bobby warned, checking his weapons magazine. "And they've seen which way we went." "Not for long," Jenkins assured him, executing a sharp turn onto an even narrower path. "I know these mountains better than any outsider. There's a creek crossing ahead we'll cut through, then double back along the ridge. should lose them in the process. The next 20 minutes were a bone-jarring journey deeper into the wilderness. Jenkins drove with the confidence of a man on his home terrain, taking turns and shortcuts that appeared non-existent until the last moment. Twice they crossed shallow streams, and once they detoured through an abandoned logging camp. Finally, the truck climbed a steep rocky incline and emerged onto a plateau sheltered by towering pines. A small log cabin stood in the clearing, weathered and unassuming. "Welcome to my little getaway," Jenkins said, cutting the engine. "Not much to look at, but it's defendable and off any official records." Bobby scanned their surroundings, assessing sight lines and potential approaches. The plateau offered good visibility in all directions, with only one clear road in. Tactically, it was as good a position as they could hope for under the circumstances. "It'll do," he approved. "Let's get inside and secure the perimeter." The cabin's interior was rustic but functional. A main room with a stone fireplace, small kitchen area, and 2 doors leading to what Bobby assumed were bedrooms. The furnishings were sparse: a worn sofa, wooden table with 4 chairs, and shelves lined with basic supplies. "Used to bring my boys here for hunting trips," Jenkins explained, lighting a kerosene lamp. "Haven't been up in a couple of years, but I keep it stocked." Sarah had settled on the sofa, Finn cradled against her chest. The baby had calmed somewhat, but still fussed intermittently. Ranger paced the small cabin, sniffing corners and doorways before stationing himself by the front window. "Those men," Sarah said as Bobby checked the cabin's windows, "they killed the Thompsons, didn't they?" "Most likely," Bobby confirmed grimly. "Professional hit team. Probably the same ones who posed as FBI agents." "But why?" Sarah's voice held frustration and fear in equal measure. What could be worth killing 2 scientists and hunting their baby? Jenkins rummaged through a cabinet, producing a first aid kit and bottles of water. Billions of dollars, potentially. Pharmaceutical research at that level is high stakes. Bobby completed his security check and joined them at the table, laying out his satellite phone and Jenkins' police radio. Whatever their motivation, they're well-funded and determined, and now they've seen all of us. The implication hung heavily in the air. There would be no going back to their normal lives not until this was resolved. "I need to call the state police," Jenkins said finally. "Get official resources involved." "And tell them what?" Bobby challenged. "That we're hiding a baby who might be connected to a double homicide that fake federal agents are shooting at us. We'll spend the next 48 hours being questioned while whoever's after Finn closes in." "So what do you suggest?" Jenkins demanded. "We can't fight a private army ourselves." "We don't fight. We expose." Bobby turned to Sarah. "You said the Thompsons' research could make traditional vaccines obsolete. That's the kind of innovation that could threaten established pharmaceutical companies." Sarah nodded slowly. "Their approach targeted the body's innate immunity, potentially making treatment cheaper and more accessible worldwide." "Follow the money?" Jenkins repeated Bobby's earlier words. "Who loses billions if their research succeeds." "Exactly," Bobby affirmed. "We need evidence connecting one of those companies to what's happening. Something concrete enough to force official investigation." Sarah looked down at Finn, who had finally fallen asleep despite the tension around him. "And the evidence could be right here. If the Thompsons were as brilliant as their reputation suggests, they might have found a way to preserve their research, something their killers haven't found yet." "Like what?" Jenkins asked. "I don't know. But they went to the trouble of hiding their baby with a tracker. Maybe they hid something else with him, too. Bobby's gaze shifted to the diaper bag they'd hastily packed, containing not only supplies gathered by Sarah, but also the original blanket and clothing Finn had been wearing when Ranger found him. We need to examine everything that was with him in that cradle, Bobby decided. Every thread, every seam. As Sarah began this meticulous examination, Ranger suddenly lifted his head from his paws, ears forward in alert. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Bobby moved instantly to the window, scanning the surrounding forest. Jenkins, kill the lamp. In the sudden darkness, they listened intently. For several seconds, there was nothing but the natural sounds of the forest at morning birdsong, rustling leaves, distant woodpecker. Then came the unmistakable sound of an engine, faint but growing louder. "They found us," Bobby said quietly. "Faster than I expected." Jenkins checked his service weapon. "Back exit through the bedroom window. There's a ravine that leads down to the eastern valley." Sarah had already gathered Finn against her chest, her face pale but determined in the dim light. "What about evidence? We haven't found anything yet." "No time," Bobby decided. "Our priority is keeping Finn safe. Ranger, come." The shepherd obeyed instantly, positioning himself at Sarah's side once more. As they moved toward the bedroom, the approaching engine sound grew louder, joined now by a second vehicle. Bobby knew their options were narrowing rapidly. Soon, they would be forced to make a stand or split up to improve Finn's chances. Neither option promised safety for all of them. What had started as a simple rescue in a storm had escalated into a desperate fight for survival. And somewhere in the confusion, a baby's future and possibly the future of countless other children hung in the balance. The ravine was steeper than Jenkins had described, forcing them to half-slide down its muddy slope. Sarah clutched Finn to her chest, her body curled protectively around him. Bobby led the way, creating handholds where possible, while Jenkins brought up the rear, pausing occasionally to listen for pursuit. Ranger moved alongside Sarah, his body nudging hers when she stumbled, steadying her with an instinctive understanding of her precarious balance. The sound of vehicles had stopped, replaced by the more ominous silence of men moving on foot. Professionals, hunters. "They'll split up to cover more ground," Bobby murmured as they reached the bottom of the ravine. A small stream gurgled through mossy rocks, the water ice-cold from mountain springs. 2 teams minimum, maybe with dogs. "Which way?" Sarah asked, her breath visible in the cool morning air. Finn had been remarkably quiet, as if sensing the need for silence, but his small face was scrunched with discomfort. Jenkins pointed east. "There's an old fire road about a mile downstream. Might be our best chance to reach civilization." Bobby shook his head. "Too predictable. They'll have someone watching it." He studied their surroundings, mind racing through tactical options. "We need to separate." "No," Sarah protested immediately. "Listen." Bobby's voice was gentle but firm. "They're after Finn. Everything else us. The cabin. Even the research is secondary. We split up. We increase his chances." Jenkins reluctantly nodded. "Hate to admit it, but he's right. Classic diversion strategy." Sarah looked between them, the maternal instinct to keep Finn close warring with tactical logic. "How would we do it?" "You and Finn go with Ranger. Bobby decided, Jenkins and I will create a diversion. Make them think we have the baby. You head west to the Carter's Ridge Fire Tower. There's a ranger station there, manned year-round. Real authorities, not imposters.
That's 15 miles through rough country, Jenkins objected. Which is why she needs Ranger, Bobby replied. He'll keep them safe. Find the best path. Military dogs are trained for exactly this kind of escort mission. The crack of a branch snapping in the distance silenced their discussion. Someone was coming, moving carefully but not quite carefully enough. No time to argue, Bobby whispered. Sarah, do you have your phone? She nodded, patting her jacket pocket. Keep it off until you reach the fire tower. Too easy to track otherwise. He turned to Ranger, dropping to one knee to meet the shepherd's intelligent eyes. Ranger, protect, he commanded, pointing to Sarah and Finn. Guide. The dog's posture changed subtly. His entire being focused on his new mission. Bobby reached into his pocket and produced a small object, a worn leather collar tag. He pressed it into Sarah's hand. If anyone at the ranger station questions you, show them this.
It's Ranger's military ID tag. Proves he was a service dog. That his alert is legitimate. Sarah closed her fingers around the tag, eyes glistening with unshed tears. What about you two? We'll be right behind you, Jenkins assured her, though his tone lacked conviction. Bobby shrugged off his backpack, removing only essential supplies before handing it to Sarah. Extra formula for Finn, first aid kit, water purification tablets. Should last until you reach the tower. Another snap, closer this time. Decision time. Go, Bobby urged. Stay in the stream as long as possible to mask your scent. Then head northwest. Ranger knows the command find help, use it if you get into trouble. He hesitated, then added quietly, he was trained to protect at all costs. He won't let you down. Sarah nodded, throat working as she swallowed back emotion, with one arm holding Finn securely. She reached out with the other and grasped Bobby's hand briefly. Be careful, both of you. Always am, Jenkins replied with forced lightness. Ranger, guide, Bobby commanded again. The shepherd gave him one last look, almost human in its depth, before turning to Sarah's side, ears alert and body positioned to lead the way. Bobby watched as they moved carefully upstream, Sarah keeping to the shallow water as instructed. Ranger guiding her around deeper pools and slippery rocks. Within moments, they had disappeared around a bend in the ravine. Let's make some noise, Jenkins said grimly, checking his weapon. They headed in the opposite direction, moving with deliberate carelessness, breaking twigs and disturbing stones. When they judged enough distance had been put between them and Sarah, Bobby fired a shot into the air. The report echoed through the valley, ensuring their pursuers would have a clear target to follow. The response was immediate shouts in the distance, the crashing of bodies through underbrush. That got their attention, Jenkins observed dryly. Let's hope it's all of their attention, Bobby replied, leading the way deeper into the forest at a run. They led their pursuers on a twisting chase through the wilderness, using every trick Bobby had learned in years of combat and Jenkins had absorbed from decades of hunting these mountains. They crossed streams, doubled back, created false trails. Twice they caught glimpses of their hunters' men in dark clothing, moving with military precision,
armed with high-end tactical gear. An hour into the chase, they paused in a rocky outcropping that offered momentary concealment. 4 of them, at least, Jenkins wheezed, his face flushed with exertion. Maybe more back at the vehicles. Bobby nodded, conserving his breath. Despite his fitness, the mountain terrain was punishing. They're good, not local, professional contractors, probably ex-military or intelligence. Expensive help, Jenkins noted. Who the hell can afford a team like that? Someone with a lot to lose. Bobby checked his ammunition, running lower than he'd like. We need to find a defensible position, make a stand. Can't run forever. Jenkins wiped sweat from his brow. Old fire tower might be our best bet after all. At least we'd have the high ground. Same place we sent Sarah, Bobby pointed out. Exactly. Figured that was your plan all along? Jenkins managed a grim smile. Lead the confused enemy right to where our asset is heading. Classic misdirection. Bobby started to protest, then realized the sheriff was right. Subconsciously, he'd been circling back toward the fire tower, drawn by the need to ensure Sarah and Finn's safety. Ranger would protect them, but against multiple armed opponents. We need to beat them there, Bobby decided. Set an ambush. Give Sarah time to reach authorities. They set off again, now with clear purpose. The terrain grew more challenging as they ascended toward the ridge where the fire tower stood. Both men were breathing hard, pushing their limits. The sound of a helicopter shattered the forest's quiet. That's not good, Jenkins gasped as they took cover beneath a stand of pines. Local police don't have air support in this region. They watched as the sleek black helicopter swept over the canopy. Its side door opened to reveal a man scanning the forest with binoculars. They're pulling out all the stops, Bobby observed grimly. Question is, why what makes one baby worth this kind of resource expenditure? Jenkins shook his head. Must be the research. Whatever the Thompsons discovered, it's big enough that someone's willing to commit multiple homicides and field a private army to contain it. The helicopter circled back, hovering lower this time. They pressed deeper into the pine cover, knowing their heat signatures might still be visible to sophisticated equipment. We're out of options, Bobby concluded. Can't outrun air surveillance? Jenkins nodded in grim agreement. So we make our stand here. They worked quickly, using fallen branches and rocks to create a rudimentary defensive position. Bobby positioned himself with clear sight lines to the most likely approach vectors, while Jenkins covered their rear. As they settled into wait, Bobby found his thoughts turning to Ranger, the loyal shepherd, who had started all this by following his instincts to a cradle in the woods. He wondered if dogs experienced the same kind of battlefield clarity he felt now, the strange calm that came with accepting impossible odds. She'll make it, Jenkins said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. That dog of yours would die before letting anything happen to them. Bobby nodded, throat unexpectedly tight. He would? That's what worries me. The sound of approaching footsteps ended their conversation. Bobby signaled silently to Jenkins' 2 targets, moving cautiously from the east. Both men raised their weapons, waiting for the optimal moment. The first pursuer emerged from the tree line, tactical vest visible beneath a dark jacket, rifle held at the ready. Bobby centered his sights on the man's chest, finger tightening on the trigger. The sudden crack of a single gunshot echoed through the forest, but it hadn't come from either of their weapons.
The pursuer jerked and fell. Clutching his leg, a second shot followed immediately, striking the ground near the second man, who dove for cover. "Federal agents!" a voice boomed through the trees. "Drop your weapons!" Bobby and Jenkins exchanged confused glances. The helicopter reappeared overhead, but now a loudspeaker crackled from its side. "This is FBI Special Agent Diana Carter. The area is surrounded. All armed personnel must disarm immediately." More agents appeared, moving with professional precision through the trees, weapons trained on the fallen pursuer and his hidden companion. "What the hell?" Jenkins whispered. Bobby kept his weapon ready, suspicious of this unexpected development. "Could be another trick." "Bobby McAllister," the female voice called. "Sheriff Tom Jenkins? We know you're there. Elena Thompson activated her emergency protocol before she died. We've been tracking her data ever since." At the mention of Elena Thompson, Bobby felt a chill run through him. This was either salvation or a more sophisticated trap. "If you're really FBI," he called back, "prove it. Your dog's name is Ranger, formerly designated Sierra 117 in the K-9 Special Operations Program. He served with Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly, killed in action in Kandahar Province. You received the Silver Star for actions during Operation Mountain Viper. Information not publicly available." Bobby lowered his weapon slightly. "What do you want?" "The same thing you want, Sergeant McAllister. To protect Elena Thompson's son and her research. The people hunting you are private contractors working for Meridian Pharmaceuticals. We've been building a case against them for months." Jenkins looked at Bobby. "What do you think?" Before Bobby could answer, his satellite phone vibrated. The text message displayed a single word: "Help." "Sarah."
"Sarah's in trouble,"
Bobby said, showing Jenkins the message. His mind raced through scenarios, none of them good. If she'd broken radio silence, the situation must be dire. "Could be a trap," Jenkins warned, eyeing the FBI agent still securing the area. "Perfect timing for these feds to show up, isn't it?" Bobby weighed their limited options. Trust these newcomers or go it alone in a race to reach Sarah. The helicopter hovering overhead tipped the scales with air support. They could reach the fire tower in minutes instead of hours. "We don't have a choice," he decided. Raising his voice, he called to the female agent. "We have a situation. The baby and a woman are headed to Carter's Ridge Fire Tower. They just sent a distress signal." Agent Diana Carter approached their position, holstering her weapon in a deliberate show of trust. She was shorter than Bobby had expected from her authoritative voice, with close-cropped gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the field. "Lower your weapons and come with me," she said. "My team will handle the rest of these mercenaries. We need to reach your friends before Meridian's second team does." "Second team?" Jenkins asked sharply. "Satellite picked up another vehicle approaching the fire tower access road 10 minutes ago. 3 armed individuals." Bobby didn't wait to hear more. He emerged from cover, weapon lowered but not holstered. "Let's go. Now." The helicopter ride lasted less than 5 minutes, but to Bobby, it felt like hours. He stared down at the forest canopy, searching for any sign of Sarah, Finn, or Ranger. Agent Carter sat across from him, speaking rapidly into her headset, coordinating her team's movements. "We've been investigating Meridian Pharmaceuticals for over a year," she explained during a brief pause. The Thompsons were developing a revolutionary approach to childhood immunization, something that would make traditional vaccines more effective and drastically cheaper. And Meridian didn't like the competition, Jenkins surmised. Carter nodded. They tried to buy the research. When the Thompsons refused, things escalated. Elena contacted us 3 weeks ago, said she feared for their safety. We placed them under surveillance, but they disappeared before we could establish protective custody. They went into hiding, Bobby said, and hid their baby separately as insurance. Smart move, Carter acknowledged. Elena was brilliant, had contingency plans within contingency plans. One of them was a data package sent to us automatically, if she didn't enter a specific code every 72 hours. That package included GPS coordinates for various locations, including their son's hiding place. So you knew about the baby in the woods? Bobby's voice hardened. And did nothing? We were en route when the storm hit, Carter replied evenly. By the time we reached the coordinates, the cradle was empty. Then reports of a hero dog surfaced, and we tracked the story to Sheriff Jenkins here. The helicopter banked sharply, heading toward a clearing near the base of the fire tower. Through the trees, Bobby could make out the tower's skeletal framework rising above the canopy. "There!" the pilot shouted, pointing toward movement on the ground. Bobby pressed against the window. His heart lurched as he recognized Sarah's red jacket. She was running. Finn clutched to her chest, with Ranger at her side, behind them. 2 figures in dark clothing pursued through the underbrush. "Put us down in that clearing," Carter ordered the pilot, "and get the tactical team on the ground now." The helicopter descended rapidly. Before it had fully touched down, Bobby was out the door, hitting the ground at a run. Jenkins and Carter followed close behind, weapons drawn. "Sarah?" Bobby shouted over the rotor noise. "This way." She changed direction immediately, angling toward the helicopter. Ranger stayed with her, positioning himself between her and the pursuers, even at a distance. Bobby could see the shepherd was limping, his right rear leg injured somehow. The pursuit team spotted the helicopter and hesitated momentarily before changing tactics. One continued the chase while the other raised a rifle to his shoulder. "Sniper," Bobby warned, breaking into a full sprint toward Sarah. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The rifle cracked once. Ranger, somehow sensing the threat, leaped up just as the shot was fired. The shepherd yelped, his body twisting in midair before crashing to the forest floor. "No!" The cry tore from Bobby's throat. Sarah stumbled to a halt, turning back toward the fallen dog. Bobby reached her in that moment, physically pulling her toward the helicopter. "Ranger!" she gasped, struggling against his grip. "He's hit. Get Finn to safety," Bobby ordered, pushing her toward Jenkins, who had come up behind him. "Go!" without waiting to see if she complied. Bobby turned and raced toward Ranger. The shepherd lay motionless on the ground, blood darkening his tawny fur. The shooter was reloading, taking aim again. Bobby raised his weapon and fired 3 rapid shots. The man dropped, whether hit or simply taking cover. Bobby couldn't tell. He reached Ranger and knelt beside him, heart hammering against his ribs. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, hands moving carefully over the dog's body to assess the damage. Ranger's breathing was rapid and shallow, his good eye fixed on Bobby with an almost human understanding. A bullet hit the ground inches from Bobby's knee, sending dirt spraying into his face. The second pursuer had flanked around and was closing in. Bobby positioned himself over Ranger's body, returning fire with his remaining ammunition. Sudden bursts of automatic weapons fire erupted from the helicopter's position, Carter's tactical team engaging. The forest echoed with gunshots and shouted commands. "Hang on, boy," Bobby told Ranger, gathering the shepherd carefully into his arms. The dog weighed nearly 90 pounds, but adrenaline gave Bobby strength as he lifted him. Ranger whimpered once, then went silent, his body limp. With bullets still flying around him, Bobby carried Ranger back toward the helicopter. Each step was a struggle through underbrush and over uneven ground, but he refused to leave the shepherd behind. Not after everything Ranger had done, not after finding Finn, protecting him through the storm, leading Sarah to safety. By the time Bobby reached the clearing, the firefight had ended. Carter's team had neutralized the threat, securing 2 prisoners while medics treated a third. Sarah stood by the helicopter. Finn held tightly against her as Jenkins provided cover. "He needs medical attention," Bobby gasped as he reached them, carefully laying Ranger on the ground. "Now." One of the FBI medics hurried over, medical kit in hand. The man knelt beside Ranger, his expression grim as he assessed the shepherd's injuries. "Gunshot wound to the right flank," the medic reported. "Significant blood loss. We need to stabilize him for transport." Sarah handed Finn to Jenkins and dropped to her knees beside Ranger, her nurse's training taking over. "Pressure bandage here," she directed, her hands already moving to help the medic. "And IV fluids if you have them." Bobby stood helplessly by, watching as they worked to save his dog's life. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ranger had faced death in Afghanistan protecting his handler, and now history was repeating itself in the Virginia mountains. "Bobby," Jenkins said quietly, stepping closer with Finn. "Look." The baby was awake now, his small face peering out from the blankets. Something about the blanket caught Bobby's attention, a slight bulge along one edge that didn't seem natural. With careful fingers, Bobby examined the blanket's hem, finding a small opening where the stitching had been loosened and resealed. Inside was a tiny object no bigger than a postage stamp, a micro SD card, the kind used in phones and cameras. "Elena's insurance policy," Carter said, having approached unnoticed. "The data we received mentioned a physical backup of their research, hidden with their son." Bobby stared at the tiny card. "This is what they died for, what Ranger was shot for. Information that could save millions of children worldwide." Carter confirmed. "The Thompsons created an immunity booster that works with existing vaccines, making them more effective and reducing the necessary dosage by nearly 80%. Imagine what that means for developing countries where vaccine supplies are limited and expensive." The implication sank in slowly. Bobby looked from the micro SD card to Finn's innocent face, then to Ranger's still form on the ground. The connections between them all, a dog, a baby, a life-saving medical breakthrough, seemed both random and somehow destined. "He's stabilizing," the medic announced, relief evident in his voice. "Heart rate's improving. We need to get him to a veterinary facility, but he's got a fighting chance." Sarah looked up at Bobby, her hands still applying pressure to Ranger's wound. "He saved us," she said, tears finally breaking free. "When those men found us on the trail, Ranger led them away, drew their fire. Then he circled back to warn us." Her voice caught. "He understood exactly what he needed to do." Bobby knelt beside them, one hand gently touching Ranger's head. The shepherd's eye fluttered open briefly, recognition flickering in its depths before closing again. "He's always understood," Bobby said softly. "Better than most humans," as they carefully loaded Ranger into the helicopter. Bobby found himself facing a truth he'd been avoiding since Afghanistan. Some bonds transcended explanation. The connection between a soldier and his dog, between a protector and those protected, between the broken pieces of different lives that somehow fit together to create something whole. The mystery of the Thompsons and their research was unraveling, but a new question was forming in its place, one about family, and what shape it might take after the dust settled. "With Ranger secured for transport," Bobby turned to Sarah, still holding Finn in the protective circle of her arms. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgment of what they'd been through together, and perhaps what might lie ahead. "Let's go home," he said simply. The question of where home might be remained unanswered as the helicopter lifted off, carrying its unlikely passengers away from danger and toward an uncertain future. 3 years later, autumn painted the Blue Ridge Mountains in the same vibrant colors that had backlit Ranger's fateful discovery. The old hunting cabin had been transformed, expanded with a proper addition, the weathered logs restored, a fenced yard added alongside a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of apple wood into the crisp October air. Inside, Bobby McAllister stood at the kitchen counter, deftly assembling sandwiches for lunch. At 40, the hard edges of his military bearing had softened somewhat. He still maintained the vigilance of a soldier, eyes automatically checking sight lines through windows. Ears attuned to sounds outside, but the constant tension had eased from his shoulders. "Finn, time to wash up," he called, slicing the final sandwich into triangles the way the boy preferred. From the living room came the thunder of small feet and the clicking of nails on hardwood. Finn Thompson McAllister burst into the kitchen, a blur of energy in overalls and a red flannel shirt. At his side trotted Ranger, grayer around the muzzle now, a slight hitch in his gait, the only visible reminder of the bullet that had nearly claimed his life. "Daddy, Ranger and I built a fort," Finn announced, blue eyes bright with excitement. At 3.5, he spoke in complete sentences. His vocabulary advanced beyond his years, a trait Sarah attributed to his biological parents' intelligence. "A fort? Huh?" Bobby smiled, wetting a paper towel to wipe the dirt from Finn's hands. "Did Ranger help with the heavy lifting?" "He supervised," Finn explained seriously, submitting to the cleaning with minimal squirming. "That's his 'portant job." Bobby ruffled the boy's sandy hair. "Very important job. Where's Mom?" "On the phone. Doctor stuff." Finn made a face that suggested medical conversations ranked low on his list of interesting activities, as if summoned. Sarah appeared in the doorway, phone in hand. 3 years had changed her too, her practical ponytail now replaced by a shorter cut that framed her face, laugh lines deepening at the corners of her eyes. The wariness that had once shadowed her expression had given way to a quiet confidence. "That was Dr. Abrams," she said, slipping the phone into her pocket. "Elena and James's immunity booster just received final FDA approval. It's official." Bobby nodded, absorbing the significance. "So the Thompsons' work will finally reach the children who need it."
starting next month. The WHO already has distribution plans for 40 countries. Sarah's voice held both triumph and a hint of sadness, joy for the achievement, grief for the parents who hadn't lived to see it. Finn, sensing the shift in mood, leaned against Ranger's solid form. The shepherd responded by pressing closer, his perpetual vigilance never extending to personal space where the boy was concerned.
"Will they tell about my first mommy and daddy?" Finn asked. Though young, he understood the basics of his unusual history, that he'd had parents who loved him enough to hide him, and that Ranger had found him in the woods. The more complex details would come with time. Sarah knelt to his level. "Yes, honey. Everyone will know that Dr. Elena and Dr. James Thompson created something amazing that will help children all over the world." Finn considered this solemnly. "And will they tell about Ranger too, because he's the real hero?" Bobby felt the familiar tightness in his throat, the one that appeared whenever Finn demonstrated the pure, unfiltered wisdom of childhood. "You know what I think they should? Why don't we write a letter to Dr. Abrams suggesting that very thing?" Finn brightened, always eager for projects involving letters and drawings. "Can I tell about how Ranger stayed with me all night in the rain and kept me warm?" "Absolutely," Sarah assured him, dropping a kiss on his forehead. "That's the most important part of the story." As they settled around the kitchen table for lunch, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The aftermath of the mountain confrontation had unfolded in ways none of them could have predicted. The FBI's case against Meridian Pharmaceuticals had been airtight once they added the attempted kidnapping and murder charges to the existing corporate espionage investigation. The company's CEO and several board members were serving prison sentences, while the research division had been restructured under court supervision. The Thompsons' breakthrough, contained on that tiny SD card hidden in Finn's blanket, had been verified by independent researchers and hailed as potentially the most significant advancement in childhood immunization in decades. Elena and James were posthumously recognized with humanitarian awards, their names now mentioned alongside medical pioneers throughout history. For the unlikely family formed in crisis, the path had been more personal. Ranger had survived surgery to remove the bullet lodged near his spine, enduring months of rehabilitation with the same stoic determination he'd shown in military service. The veterinarians had warned he might never walk normally again, but they'd underestimated the shepherd's resolve, particularly once he understood that Finn was counting on his recovery. Bobby and Sarah's relationship had evolved from crisis allies to something deeper, forged in shared purpose and mutual respect. Their marriage the following spring had been a small affair on the cabin's newly built porch, with Jenkins officiating, Finn as ring-bearer, and Ranger standing attention beside Bobby throughout the ceremony. The adoption of Finn had proceeded with surprisingly little bureaucratic resistance, thanks partly to Agent Carter's influence and partly to the unique circumstances of his case. With no surviving relatives identified and clear evidence of the Thompsons' intentions to protect their son at all costs. The courts had recognized Bobby and Sarah as Finn's legal guardians, the family his parents would have chosen had they been able. Sarah maintained her nursing career, now working part-time at the rural clinic 30 minutes from their mountain home. Bobby had found unexpected purpose in veteran outreach, using his experiences with Ranger to develop a program pairing former service dogs with combat veterans struggling with PTSD. The initial pilot, funded by a grant from the restructured Meridian Foundation as part of their court-mandated restitution, had shown promising results. "Can Ranger and I go back to our fort after lunch?" Finn asked, breaking into Bobby's reflections.
"Only if you eat your carrots," Sarah answered, using the universal parental currency of vegetable negotiations. Finn sighed dramatically but complied, slipping a carrot to Ranger under the table when he thought no one was looking. The shepherd accepted the offering with dignified gentleness, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. The bond between child and dog remained something of a marvel to observe. Ranger, who had once responded only to military commands and Bobby's voice, now communicated with Finn through an intricate language of looks and subtle movements. The shepherd anticipated the boy's needs, often positioning himself to prevent falls or steering Finn away from potential dangers before either Bobby or Sarah noticed them. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, as Finn finished his lunch and raced back outside, Ranger following at a measured pace. "About what you said last week, expanding the veteran dog program." Bobby nodded, gathering plates. "Jenkins knows a rancher over in Madison County willing to donate 10 acres for a training facility. We could house more dogs, work with more vets." "I think we should do it," Sarah said, her expression thoughtful. "What Ranger did for you, for Finn, for all of us, that shouldn't be rare. That connection could help so many people." Bobby leaned against the counter, watching through the window as Finn showed Ranger something in the yard, probably an interesting rock or bug, given the boy's current fascinations. "It's not just about the dogs. You know, it's about purpose. Ranger saved Finn, but in many ways, Finn saved Ranger too. Gave him a mission when he'd lost his way." Sarah came to stand beside him, her shoulder touching his. "Like you." He didn't deny it. The truth was, finding Finn becoming a father, a husband, building this life had healed something in Bobby that he'd thought permanently broken in the mountains of Afghanistan. Outside, Finn had climbed onto a log, arms outstretched for balance. Ranger positioned himself immediately below, ready to break any potential fall. The shepherd no longer startled at sudden noises, no longer woke whimpering from nightmares of explosions and gunfire. Like Bobby, he had found his way home through unexpected paths. "I got a call from Agent Carter yesterday," Bobby said, watching Finn successfully navigate the length of the log under Ranger's supervision. "They're closing the final chapters of the Thompson case. All the Meridian conspirators have been sentenced." "Good," Sarah said simply. "Elena and James deserve justice." "Carter mentioned something else," Bobby continued. "Elena's parents died years ago, but James had a brother they finally located in Australia. He's a marine biologist, been working on the Great Barrier Reef for the past decade. That's why they had trouble finding him." Sarah turned to face him, understanding the implication. "Finn has an uncle," Bobby nodded. "Carter says he's flying in next week, wants to meet his nephew. Didn't even know James had a son." "How do you feel about that?" Sarah asked gently, knowing Bobby's protective instincts when it came to Finn. He considered the question honestly. 3 years ago, I'd have seen it as a threat. Now, he shrugged. Finn deserves to know his blood family, to hear stories about his parents from someone who knew them, and we're secure enough to welcome that connection, aren't we? Sarah's smile was answer enough. She leaned up to kiss him briefly. "Look at you, all emotionally mature and everything." Bobby laughed. The sound still relatively new in this house that had known so much tension. "Don't tell Jenkins. He thinks I'm still the same hard case I was in the Rangers. Outside, Finn had abandoned the log-walking exercise and was now engaged in an elaborate game of fetch, throwing a ball that Ranger retrieved with dignified patience. The autumn sun caught the golden highlights in the boy's hair that, according to the single photo they had of James Thompson, matched his biological father's exactly. "We should invite Jenkins for dinner when James's brother visits," Sarah suggested. "Family gathering." Bobby nodded, arms slipping around her waist as they watched their son playing with the dog who had changed all their lives. "Family," he agreed. "Funny how that works out sometimes." Through the open window came the sound of Finn's laughter, punctuated by Ranger's single acknowledging bark the family they had built. Not from blood, but from something perhaps stronger choice, courage, and the unbreakable bond formed when protecting what matters most. Life doesn't always give us the family we expected, but sometimes delivers the one we need most. This story of Ranger, a wounded military dog who found purpose in saving an abandoned baby, speaks to what we've learned in our own journeys, that our deepest scars can become our greatest strengths. Remember how we weathered the uncertainties of raising our children, the sleepless nights wondering if we were doing it right, like Bobby. Many of us carried invisible wounds from our own battles, whether from Vietnam or life's other painful chapters. And like Sarah, we've known